The stale air of the Fairfax County Courthouse hummed with a quiet procedural boredom, a sound Richard Sterling found deeply satisfying. He was in complete control. Beside him, his much younger girlfriend, Candice Munro, squeezed his hand, her perfume a cloud of cloying victory. Across the aisle, his ex-wife, Ava, looked small and defeated, her shoulders slumped in a worn-out blazer. She was alone, he'd made sure of that, bleeding her dry until she couldn't even afford a decent lawyer. The judge was about to finalize a settlement that would leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back. The aesthetics of success had always been Richard Rick Sterling's true religion. His life was a carefully curated Instagram feed brought to life, a testament to a man who had conquered Northern Virginia's ruthless private equity scene. There was the sprawling 5-bedroom colonial in McLean, with its perfectly manicured zoysia grass, the gleaming black Porsche 911 tucked into the 3-car garage, and the membership at the Congressional Country Club, where the water was always the perfect temperature and the gin was always top shelf. At 48, Rick believed he had finally reached the summit, but as he sat in the courtroom, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of his mahogany table, he didn't see the woman who had carried the stones to build that mountain. For 15 years, Ava Reynolds had been the silent, indispensable architect of the Sterling facade. She was the one who remembered the names of his partner's children, who cultivated friendships with the right couples at charity galas, and who transformed a cold house into a home worthy of an Architectural Digest spread. She had been a rising star once, a painter with a brushstroke that critics called hauntingly luminous. Her studio in Old Town Alexandria had been her sanctuary, a place filled with the sharp, clean scent of turpentine and the promise of a legacy. But when Rick's career began its meteoric ascent, he had leaned over her easel, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Just for a little while, babe," he'd whispered, his hands on her shoulders. "Until we're stable. Your art is wonderful, but it's a hobby. My career will build our empire. Once we're set, you can paint all day." Ava, trusting and deeply in love, had agreed. She packed away her canvases, wrapped her easels in heavy plastic, and traded the splatters of cobalt blue for the meticulous management of a household. She applied the same detail she once gave to a portrait to Rick's life, creating a seamless, frictionless world in which he could thrive. She was the foundation, unseen, uncredited, and eventually unappreciated. As Rick's bank account grew, so did his resentment. Her quiet competence began to feel like a judgment. Her gentle reminders about family obligations felt like a leash. The very stability she provided became a bore. He started to see her not as his partner, but as part of the domestic scenery, as functional and unexciting as the sub-zero refrigerator in their designer kitchen. Then came Candice. Candice Munro was a brand strategist he'd met at a conference in Miami. She was 26, beautiful in an obvious high-maintenance way, and possessed a voracious appetite for things she couldn't afford. She didn't talk about Lily's ballet recitals or leaking faucets. She talked about yacht parties in Monaco and the liberating philosophy of living in the moment. She looked at Rick not as a father or a husband who forgot to take out the recycling, but as a titan of finance. She was a mirror reflecting back the image of the man Rick desperately wanted to be, and he became addicted to the view. The affair was clumsy, born of Rick's growing arrogance. There were late-night board meetings that didn't exist, suspicious charges at the Ritz-Carlton on 24th Street, and the faint, sweet smell of a strange floral perfume that clung to his shirts like a confession. Ava saw the signs with a clarity that felt like a physical blow to the chest. She had spent a decade and a half managing the details of his world. She was the last person he could ever hope to trick. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was brutal. It took place in the marble entryway of the home she had created. Rick didn't apologize. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He announced his departure like a quarterly earnings report. "Ava, it's just not working anymore," he said, standing next to a suitcase he'd already packed. "We've grown apart. People change." "People don't just change, Rick. You're having an affair," she replied, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. He actually scoffed, a sound of pure condescension. "Don't be so dramatic. This is for the best. I'm doing us a favor, setting us both free." The freedom he offered was a cage. The moment he moved into a lavish penthouse in the city with Candice, he weaponized the very empire Ava had helped him build. He cut off her credit cards, claiming he needed to separate assets. He moved his money into accounts she couldn't see and hired a bottom-feeder lawyer named Barry Finch, a man whose cheap suits and desperate eyes were an insult in themselves. Rick's strategy was one of attrition. He knew Ava had no independent income. He knew she had sacrificed her career for his, and he used that fact as a cudgel. "It's more than fair, Ava," he told her over the phone, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. "You haven't worked in 15 years. You have no claim to my earnings. Be smart. Take the pittance I'm offering, or you'll end up with even less." Now, sitting in the courtroom, Rick felt the surge of his final victory. The judge, a weary-looking man in his 60s named Miller, shuffled through the papers. "Case 2025 Dive 742, Sterling versus Sterling," the judge droned. "Mr. Finch, I see the petitioner's settlement offer, and Mrs. Reynolds." He looked over his glasses at Ava, who sat alone at the respondent's table. "The court notes you are representing yourself today. Your previous counsel withdrew." Ava stood up. Her hands were clasped in front of her, hidden beneath the table so no one could see them shaking. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys. "Not exactly, Your Honor," Ava said, her voice thin but clear. Rick leaned back, a smug smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Here comes the begging," he thought. The tears, the pleas for more time, the desperate grasping at a life that no longer belongs to her. But before the judge could respond, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a sound like a guillotine dropping. The sound was so authoritative that every head in the room turned. Framed in the doorway was a woman who seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She was tall, encased in a charcoal-grey Armani suit that likely cost more than Barry Finch's car. Her black hair was pulled into a severe, elegant chignon, and her face was a mask of cold, predatory intelligence. Behind her stood a team of 3 others, 2 men and a woman, all in equally sharp suits, carrying leather briefcases with the coordinated efficiency of a special forces unit. The woman strode down the center aisle, her hard-soled shoes clicking on the linoleum with a sound like a ticking clock counting down to an execution. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at Rick. She walked directly to Ava's side, placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder, and then turned to face the bench. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice cut through the room like shattered glass. "Forgive our tardiness. Isabel Rossi, senior partner at Blackwood and Finch. We have been retained by Mrs. Ava Reynolds, and we are now her counsel of record." Rick's world didn't just stop. It detonated. He worked in finance. He knew that name. Blackwood and Finch wasn't just a law firm. It was the personal legal armada of Alistair Finch, the most reclusive and ruthless billionaire in the country. They didn't handle suburban divorces. They handled hostile takeovers and international litigation. Rick looked at Ava, who was finally looking back at him. For the first time in months, the exhaustion was gone from her eyes. In its place was a stillness that terrified him. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute that Rick could hear the frantic thudding of his own heart. Judge Miller remained frozen, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He had presided over thousands of divorces in Fairfax County, but he had never seen a senior partner from Blackwood and Finch, a firm that charged by the minute what most people made in a month, step into his chambers for a domestic dispute. Isabel Rossi didn't wait for the judge to find his voice. She signaled to her team, and with a synchronized snap of leather latches, 3 briefcases were opened. "Your Honor," Rossi continued, her tone possessing the smooth, terrifying weight of a falling mountain, "we wish to file a motion to immediately stay these proceedings. We have reason to believe the petitioner's current settlement offer is not only unconscionable, but is predicated on a fraudulent declaration of marital assets." "Fraudulent?" Barry Finch, Rick's lawyer, finally managed to squeak. He stood up, his face an ashen shade of grey that matched his ill-fitting suit. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have provided all discovery. My client has been completely transparent." Isabel Rossi didn't even turn to look at him. She looked at Barry with the same clinical indifference a biologist might show a particularly uninteresting specimen of mold. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "I suggest you sit down before you inadvertently commit yourself to a malpractice suit you cannot afford." Barry sat. It wasn't a choice. His legs simply seemed to give way. Rick felt a cold, oily dread slither down his spine. His mind raced, cataloguing the hidden offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets buried under layers of encryption, and the shell corporation in Delaware he'd used to buy the Aspen condo. How, he thought, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. There is no way she found those. She's a painter. She's a housewife who shops at Whole Foods and worries about the humidity levels for her peonies. He looked at Ava. She was standing perfectly still, her hand still resting near Isabel Rossi's. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't screaming. She was simply present. For the first time in years, she looked like the woman who had once stood before a blank canvas and seen a world that didn't exist yet. 6 weeks ago, Ava Reynolds had been convinced she was a ghost. After Rick moved out, the silence in the McLean house had become a physical weight. The room she had spent 15 years curated with love, the hand-woven Persian rugs, the carefully selected mid-century modern lamps, the photos of a smiling family on the mahogany mantel, now felt like a museum of a dead civilization. Rick had been surgical in his cruelty. The day after he left, her sterling platinum credit card was declined at the grocery store while she was buying Lily's favorite organic cereal. A week later, the gardener stopped showing up. Then the utilities began sending final notice warnings in bright, aggressive red envelopes. Ava sat at the polished dining table, her life spread out before her in legal documents that read like a death sentence. She had contacted 3 different divorce attorneys. Each one had looked at her situation: no independent income, no access to marital funds, a powerful husband determined to stonewall, and told her the same thing. "We need a $20,000 retainer just to open the file, Mrs. Reynolds," one had said, eyes flickering with a pity that made her stomach turn. "Without capital, you can't fight a man like Richard Sterling. He'll bury you in motions until you're forced to sign." Despair was a cold, nauseating wave. Rick had planned this perfectly. He had systematically stripped her of her independence over the years, and now he was foreclosing on her life. She had eventually found a part-time job at Buchan Books, a dusty, independent shop in a quiet corner of Arlington. She made $14 an hour shelving inventory. Her days became a grueling routine of quiet degradation, waking before dawn to make Lily breakfast, seeing her off to the private school Rick was now threatening to stop paying for, and then driving her aging SUV, the sensible car Rick had let her keep while he took the Porsche, to the bookstore. She spent her shifts surrounded by stories of epic struggles and triumphant heroes, while her own life felt like a tragedy stuck in the first act. Her mind was a constant, frantic whirl of calculations. Could she afford the electric bill? If she skipped lunch, could she fill the gas tank completely? One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while sorting through a box of used books in the store's cramped back room, a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. It was from nearly 8 years ago. Ava had been volunteering at a small non-profit gallery in Georgetown. It was a miserable, sleeting day. and the gallery was empty except for her and a man who had been staring at the same abstract painting for nearly an hour. He was impeccably dressed in a simple but clearly expensive cashmere coat, yet he looked utterly lost. His face was etched with a grief so raw it seemed to vibrate in the air. He had approached the desk, his eyes hollow. I seem to have lost something," he'd said, his voice raspy. "A locket. It was my wife's. She passed away last month. It's all I have left of her." Ava's heart had gone out to him. For the next hour, she didn't just point him toward a lost and found bin. She crawled on the floor, checked under heavy oak furniture, and retraced every step he'd taken in the building. Finally, tucked into the deep crease of an armchair where he had sat for a moment of reflection, she found it, a simple, elegant silver locket. The man's relief was staggering. He held the silver heart in his palm as if it were a living thing. He had reached for a thick alligator skin wallet, ready to give her every bill inside. Ava had gently pushed his hand away. "Absolutely not," she'd said with a soft, sincere smile. "I'm just glad we found it. Anyone would have done the same. Please, hold on to your memories." He had looked at her then, truly looked at her, his gaze clearing for the first time. "Thank you," he'd said. "You have no idea what this means. My name is Alistair. I won't forget this." She had never asked for a last name. She had never seen him again. Over the years, the memory had faded into the background of her own domestic dramas, a small hobby of kindness that Rick would have mocked as a waste of time. But 3 days before the final hearing, a single crisp cream-colored envelope had arrived in her mailbox. It was thick, heavy cardstock. There was no return address. Inside was no letter, just a single stark black business card with silver engraving. Isabel Rossi, senior partner, Blackwood and Finch. Clipped to it was a small typed note. "Mrs. Reynolds, a mutual acquaintance believes you may be in need of representation. The initial consultation and subsequent retainer have been taken care of. We are confident we can achieve a more equitable outcome." Ava had stared at the card for an hour, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew the name. Everyone in the DC orbit knew the name. They were the vultures, the lions, the gods. They were the firm you couldn't hire unless you were already on the Forbes list. She hadn't known then that in a quiet penthouse office overlooking Central Park, an old man named Alistair Finch had just gotten off the phone with his top litigator. "Isabel," he had said, his voice still raspy after all these years. "Spare no expense. I'm calling in a very old debt, a debt of kindness that I've carried for 8 years." Back in the courtroom, Isabel Rossi stepped toward Rick's table. The movement was fluid, like a predator closing the distance. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping to a silken threat that made Candice Munro flinch. "We have spent the last 72 hours conducting a preliminary forensic audit of your domestic and international filings. It seems you have a very creative approach to accounting." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a legal motion. It was a list. Rick looked down. His eyes scanned the first 3 lines, and the blood drained from his face so quickly he felt faint. 1. Account number 8842, Cayman National. 2. Wallet address 0x71C, Ethereum. 3. Sky High Holdings, LLC, Delaware. "This is just the table of contents, Richard," Isabel whispered, loud enough only for him and his lawyer to hear. "By the time I'm finished, you won't just be losing this house. You'll be lucky if you aren't wearing a jumpsuit that matches your girlfriend's dress." Rick looked at Candice, who was suddenly looking at him with a dawning selfish panic. Then he looked back at Ava. She wasn't the domestic scenery anymore. She was the storm. The sound of Judge Miller's gavel wasn't a sharp crack. It was a dull thud that felt, to Rick, like the first shovel of earth hitting a coffin lid. "In light of these grave allegations," Judge Miller said, his voice now stripped of its previous boredom and replaced with a sharp, judicial edge, This court will grant the respondent's motion for an immediate stay. Mr. Sterling, you are ordered to freeze all accounts, domestic and international, effective immediately. A preliminary discovery conference is scheduled for 10 days from today. And Mr. Finch? The judge looked at Barry, who was sweating so profusely his collar had turned translucent. I suggest you advise your client on the very real penalties for perjury and financial fraud in this Commonwealth. We are adjourned. The courtroom erupted into a low, frantic murmur. Rick sat paralyzed as Isabel Rossi and her team began packing their leather briefcases with chilling, silent efficiency. Candace was tugging at his arm, her voice a sharp, annoying whine in his ear. "Rick, what did she mean about offshore accounts? You said the Aspen condo was a corporate perk. Rick, look at me." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He was staring at the back of Ava's head as she walked toward the exit. She moved with a grace he hadn't seen in years, her spine straight, her steps unhurried. This is a bluff, Rick told himself, his predatory instincts screaming for a way to regain leverage. She's a painter. She's soft. She doesn't have the stomach for a real war. She's just being used by this firm to get a bigger payday. He shook off Candace's hand and surged toward the aisle, catching up to Ava just as she reached the heavy mahogany doors of the hallway. "Ava!" he barked. It was the voice he used for subordinates, the one intended to remind her of the hierarchy they had lived under for 15 years. Ava stopped. She didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her expression as calm as a frozen lake. Isabel Rossi stepped slightly to the side, allowing the confrontation, but hovering like a sleek, charcoal-grey shark. "Ava, let's be reasonable," Rick said, lowering his voice, trying to find that old, whiskey-smooth resonance that had always worked on her. "You don't want this. These people, they're sharks. They'll eat both of us alive. Think about Lily. Think about the scandal. We can settle this right now, just the two of us. I'll double the offer, triple it. Just tell them to stand down." Ava looked at him, really looked at him, and Rick felt a jolt of genuine fear. For 15 years, he had seen himself reflected in her eyes as a king. Now he saw himself as something small, frantic, and fundamentally ugly. "You're not doing this for Lily, Rick," Ava said softly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. "You're doing this because you're afraid for the first time in your life. You spent 15 years convincing me that I was a hobby. You spent the last 6 months trying to erase me. You didn't just want a divorce. You wanted a disappearance." "Ava, please." "Mr. Sterling," Isabel Rossi interrupted, her voice a silken blade. "You are currently attempting to solicit an unrepresented party, technically represented by me, without counsel present. If you speak one more word to my client, I will file for a permanent restraining order before the ink on today's transcript is dry. Now move." Rick stepped back as if he'd been struck. He watched them walk away, the high-powered legal team forming a protective phalanx around his housewife ex-wife. Rick's mistake wasn't just the hallway confrontation. It was the belief that the war would stay in the courtroom. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the aesthetics of his success began to disintegrate. He arrived at his office, the penthouse suite of Sterling and Associates, to find 2 men in dark suits standing by the receptionist's desk. They weren't clients. They were couriers from Blackwood and Finch. "Richard Sterling?" one of them asked. "Who wants to know?" Rick snapped. "Subpoenas, sir, for the firm's travel and expense reports for the last 5 fiscal years, and a separate summons for your managing partner, Mr. Henderson." The receptionist, a woman named Sarah who had worked for Rick for 6 years, looked down at her keyboard, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. Rick felt the eyes of the entire office on him. The whispers, which had always been about his latest big catch, shifted instantly. He retreated into his glass-walled office, but the transparency he had once loved now felt like a cage. He watched through the glass as Henderson, a man who valued discretion above all else, took the documents with a face like stone. 30 minutes later, Henderson walked into Rick's office without knocking. He didn't sit down. "Rick, what the hell is this?" Henderson gestured to the hallway. "Blackwood and Finch. Why is Alistair Finch's personal hit squad sending couriers to our firm? This isn't a divorce, Rick. This is a colonoscopy." "It's a glitch, Bill. My ex found some bottom-feeder way to get their attention. I'll handle it." "Handle it? They've already sent a preservation notice for our servers. They're looking at the St. Bart's trip, Rick, the client development trip you took in April." Rick felt the air leave his lungs. St. Bart's. April. The trip he'd taken with Candice, coded as a meeting with a French investor who didn't exist. He had embezzled $20,000 to pay for that villa. "Bill, listen." "No, you listen," Henderson hissed. "The board is already calling for an internal audit. Until this glitch is cleared up, you're on administrative leave. Effective immediately. Hand over your keycard and your corporate Amex." While Rick's world was being dismantled by surgical strikes, Ava returned to the one place that felt real, the bookstore. She didn't need the $14 an hour anymore. Isabel had informed her that an anonymous benefactor had established a trust to cover all her expenses until the settlement. But she needed the ritual. She needed to say goodbye to the version of herself that had learned to survive on scraps. As she shelved a row of art history texts, her hand brushed against a small, heavy object in the pocket of her worn blazer. She pulled it out. It was a palette knife. She had found it a week ago in a box of old supplies she'd hidden in the basement. The blade was stainless steel, slightly tarnished but still sharp, with a flexible tip and a wooden handle stained with a smudge of dried cobalt blue, the last color she had used before she gave it all up. A palette knife was a tool of dualities. It was used to build layers of beautiful, thick impasto, creating texture and life. But it was also used to scrape a canvas clean, to strip away the mistakes, the lies, and the failed drafts to find the white space underneath. Ava gripped the handle. For years, she had let Rick use a different kind of knife on her, the kind that cut her down, that whittled her into a shape that fit his ego. No more, she thought. I am the one holding the tool now. She looked up to see a black SUV idling at the curb outside the bookstore's window. The tinted glass slid down, and for a fleeting second she saw the silhouette of an older man in a cashmere coat. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a debt being paid in full, before the window slid back up and the car merged into the DC traffic. That evening Rick returned to the McLean house to find the locks had been changed. He stood on the porch, his face turning a mottled purple as he pounded on the door. "Ava, open this door. This is my house. I pay the mortgage on this house." The door opened, but it wasn't Ava. It was a private security guard, a man whose chest was the size of a refrigerator. "Mr. Sterling," the guard said calmly, "there is a court-ordered exclusion in effect. Your personal items have been moved to the garage. You have 30 minutes to collect what you can fit in your car." Rick looked past the guard. He saw the hallway he had walked 1,000 times. He saw a canvas, a blank, white canvas, standing on an easel in the sunroom. And then he saw Candice. She was sitting in the Porsche in the driveway, her face buried in her phone, her luggage already piled in the back seat. She wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at the real estate listings in Miami. The realization hit him then, cold and sharp as a palette knife scraping bone. He hadn't just lost the house. He had lost the audience for the play he had been starring in. And without an audience, a man like Richard Sterling didn't exist at all. The headquarters of Blackwood and Finch did not look like a law firm. Located on the top floors of a glass spire at the wharf, it felt more like the bridge of an interstellar dreadnought. The lobby was a cathedral of white Calacatta marble and silent black-clad receptionists who moved with the grace of high-end assassins. Rick Sterling sat in the waiting area, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy he couldn't suppress. He was wearing his best charcoal brioni suit, but for the first time in his life he felt underdressed, not because of the fabric, but because of the atmosphere. The air here didn't just smell like expensive filtered oxygen, it smelled like consequence. Beside him, Candice was a fraying nerve. She was wearing a tight cherry-red bandage dress and 4-inch Louboutins, an outfit she had chosen to assert dominance. But in this sea of quiet, understated power, she looked like a neon sign in a monastery. "Rick, why do I have to be here?" she hissed, checking her reflection in her phone for the 10th time. "My name isn't on any of your bank stuff. This is boring." "It's a deposition, Candice. Standard procedure," Rick lied, his voice tight. "Rossi is just trying to rattle us. Stay calm, say you don't recall, and we'll be out of here by lunch. I promised you that lunch at Le Diplomate, remember?" Mr. Sterling, Ms. Monroe? A young associate whose suit probably cost 3 months of Ava's bookstore salary appeared. "Ms. Rossi is ready for you in the Titan Room." The Titan Room was a conference space with a 30-foot glass wall overlooking the Potomac River. Isabel Rossi sat at the head of a massive obsidian table, flanked by 2 stenographers and a digital recording setup. Ava was there too, sitting next to a man Rick didn't recognize, a sharp-eyed analyst with a laptop open to a screen filled with scrolling green data. Ava didn't look at Rick. She was looking at a small sketchbook in front of her, her fingers tracing the edge of a charcoal pencil. "Please, be seated," Isabel said. She didn't offer water. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply pressed a button on the recording device. "This is the deposition of Candice Monroe in the matter of Sterling versus Reynolds. Ms. Monroe, you are under oath. Do you understand the penalties for perjury?" Candice tossed her blonde hair, a practiced move of defiance. "I do." Isabel Rossi smiled, a thin, predatory line. "Wonderful. Let's talk about April 12th through the 16th, St. Bart's. You stayed at the Villa Marie, correct?" "Yes, it was a vacation." "A vacation paid for by Sterling and Associates," Isabel corrected, sliding a document across the obsidian. "Mr. Sterling filed this as a client development trip with a Mr. Henri Dubois. Did you meet Mr. Dubois, Candice?" Candice glanced at Rick. He gave a microscopic nod. "I think so. We had dinner with a lot of people." "That's interesting," Isabel said, her voice dropping into a conversational purr. "Because our investigators contacted every Henri Dubois in the French private equity sector. None of them were in St. Bart's that week. In fact, we found that the business meetings listed on this expense report happened at the Nikki Beach Club and a jewelry boutique called Diamond Genesis. Do you recognize this receipt?" She slid a second paper forward. It was for a Cartier love bracelet. $19,000. "Rick gave that to me for my birthday," Candice said, her voice rising. "It's a gift." "Indeed, a gift purchased with a corporate credit card and coded as client appreciation gifts," Isabel said. She turned her gaze to Rick for a split second, long enough for him to feel the heat of the fire she was building. "Ms. Monroe, are you aware that falsifying corporate documents to fund personal travel and gifts constitutes embezzlement and wire fraud, both of which carry significant federal prison time?" Candice's jaw went slack. The assertive dominance vanished, replaced by a raw, unadulterated panic. "Prison? No," Rick said. "Rick said it was all fine. He said it was his money." "Rick lied to you, Candice," Isabel said softly. "Just like he lied to his wife, just like he lied to the IRS. He didn't bring you into his life because he loved you. He brought you into his life because he needed a mirror for his own vanity. And now he's going to let you take the fall for his creative accounting." "That's enough!" Rick shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a divorce, not a grand jury. You're badgering her." Isabel Rossi didn't even flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Candice's. "Candice, I'm going to offer you a choice. You can continue to protect a man who is currently being audited by his own firm, or you can tell us the truth about the hidden accounts he bragged about during those late-night dinners in Miami. I know about the Singapore account, Candice. I know Rick told you it was your safety net if things ever got ugly." Rick felt the air leave the room. He had told Candice about Singapore in a moment of post-coital arrogance, wanting to prove he was the titan she thought he was. Candice looked at Rick. She saw the sweat on his upper lip. She saw the way his expensive suit seemed to be swallowing him whole. Then she looked at Ava, who finally looked up from her sketchbook. Ava's gaze wasn't mocking. It was steady. It was the gaze of someone who had already survived the fire and was waiting for others to decide if they wanted to burn. He has a folder," Candice whispered, her voice cracking. "In his private safe at the penthouse. He called it his lifeboat. He said it had enough crypto and offshore routing numbers to buy a new life in a country without an extradition treaty." "Candice, shut up," Rick roared. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Isabel Rossi commanded. The power in her voice was absolute. "The lifeboat has already been seized. We served a warrant on your penthouse an hour ago." While Rick was being dismantled in the Titan room, Ava felt a strange, detached peace. She had spent years fearing Rick's voice, fearing his moods, fearing the way he could make her feel like a shadow in her own home. But watching him now, she realized he wasn't a giant. He was just a man who had built a kingdom out of stolen bricks. After the deposition, as they waited for the elevator, Ava found herself alone in the hallway for a moment. She reached into her bag and felt the wooden handle of her palette knife. The symbolic object had become her talisman. That morning, before coming to the office, she had stood in the sunroom of the McLean house, now legally hers again through an emergency injunction, and she had squeezed a tube of zinc white onto a glass plate. She had used the knife to spread the paint, the sound of the metal scraping the glass a song of restoration. She wasn't painting a portrait of Rick. She was painting the light. The elevator doors opened, and Isabel Rossi stepped out, looking perfectly refreshed. "You did well, Ava," Isabel said. "I didn't do anything," Ava replied. "I just sat there." "Sometimes sitting still is the most aggressive thing you can do," Isabel noted. She handed Ava a small tablet. "Alistair would like to speak with you." The screen flickered to life. Alistair Finch was sitting in a library filled with leather-bound books. He looked older than he had in the gallery 8 years ago, his hair a shock of silver, but his eyes were the same. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice a warm rasp. "I trust Isabel is taking care of the clutter in your life." "Alistair, I still don't understand," Ava said. "Why all of this? The locket was just a locket. I didn't even know who you were." "That is exactly why it mattered," Alistair said. "Most people see me as a bank, or a ladder, or a threat. You saw a man who had lost the only thing that gave his life color. You gave me back my wife's heart, Ava. In my world, that is a debt that cannot be calculated in percentages. Richard Sterling tried to treat you like a line item he could erase. I am simply reminding him that some things are priceless." "He's going to lose everything, isn't he?" "He isn't losing anything he actually earned," Alistair replied. "He is simply being introduced to the reality he created." The escalation didn't stop at the firm. That evening, Rick returned to his penthouse to find the door sealed with yellow tape, not from the police but from the firm's private security. A notice of internal audit was taped to the glass. He drove to the Ritz-Carlton, his mind a static-filled void. He reached for his corporate Amex to pay for the room. Declined. He reached for his personal visa. Declined. He sat in the lobby, the same lobby where he had once held court with millionaires, and he realized he was down to the $400 in his wallet. He checked his phone. A notification from Instagram popped up. Candice Monroe had posted a story. She was at the airport, a suitcase by her side. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to cut the dead weight to fly. New beginnings. Miami-bound. She hadn't even waited for him to lose the case. She had smelled the smoke and run before the first flame touched her. Rick sank into a velvet chair. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling was alone. No wife to manage his world, no mistress to stroke his ego, no firm to shield his greed. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ava's number. He didn't even know what he was going to say. Maybe he would beg. Maybe he would threaten. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Ava hadn't just blocked him. She had deleted the bridge. The morning of the final settlement conference was a study in monochromatic grey. A cold, relentless drizzle fell over Washington, D.C., blurring the lines between the Potomac River and the sky. Rick Sterling sat in the back of a taxi. His Porsche had been repossessed 48 hours prior, staring at his reflection in the window. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His skin was sallow, the expensive Brioni suit hung loose on his frame, and the confident swagger had been replaced by a frantic, twitching uncertainty. He had spent the last 3 nights in a motel in Arlington that smelled of lemon-scented bleach and old cigarettes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scrolling green numbers of the lifeboat accounts he had thought were invisible. The taxi pulled up to the glass spire of Blackwood and Finch. Rick stepped out into the rain, his cheap umbrella flipping inside out within seconds. He stood there, drenched and shivering, looking up at the 50th floor. He wasn't a king coming to negotiate. He was a prisoner heading to the gallows. Inside, the atmosphere was even more sterile than before. He was led not to the Titan room, but to a smaller, more intimate space at the very end of a long, soundproofed corridor. The staff called it the library, but in legal circles it was known as the kill room. There were no windows here, only walls of leather-bound books and a massive obsidian table that seemed to drink the light. Ava was already there. When Rick saw her, he felt a jolt of something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite regret. It was a visceral shock. She was wearing a simple, elegant, cream-colored dress, the color of unprimed canvas, and her hair was down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked younger, more vibrant, as if the weight he had piled on her for 15 years had been lifted overnight. Sitting to her left was Isabel Rossi. To her right sat an unfamiliar man, a silver-haired, hawk-eyed analyst named Elias Vance, who Alistair Finch's team had flown in from Zurich. "Mr. Sterling," Isabel said, her voice a low, clinical hum. "Please be seated. Where is Mr. Finch?" Barry withdrew," Rick stammered, his voice sounding thin in the acoustically perfect room. "He said he had a conflict of interest. He's terrified of you, isn't he?" "Mr. Finch is terrified of the law," Isabel corrected, "which is a sensible emotion given the circumstances. Since you are now unrepresented, I must inform you that this conference is being recorded for the purpose of a final binding settlement. Do you understand?" Rick nodded dumbly. He looked at Ava, hoping for a sliver of the old softness, a flicker of the woman who used to bring him tea when he worked late. But her eyes were fixed on the obsidian table. She was holding her palette knife, the symbolic tool she had retrieved from her basement, fiddling with the wooden handle as if it were a rosary. "Let's begin," Isabel said. She slid a document nearly 2 inches thick across the table. "This is the account of total marital assets. It includes the $14 million we uncovered in Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and the crypto wallets hidden in your lifeboat safe. It also includes the liquidated value of your partnership at Sterling and Associates." "Liquidated?" Rick's head snapped up. "I haven't been fired. I'm on leave." "You were fired this morning at 8 a.m., Richard," Isabel said, showing no emotion. The internal audit discovered the St. Bart's embezzlement, along with 3 other instances of client development fraud totaling $600,000. The board has opted not to press charges if you surrender your equity immediately. We have already handled that on your behalf as part of the asset seizure. Rick felt as if he were underwater. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 600,000. That's insane. It was business. Everyone does it. Not everyone does it with Blackwood and Finch watching. Elias Vance spoke up, his voice carrying a sharp European clip. We didn't just look at the receipts, Mr. Sterling. We interviewed the flight crews. We spoke to the concierge at the Nikki Beach Club. We have your digital footprint on the company servers. You weren't a genius. You were just lucky no one was looking. Until now. Isabel Rossi leaned forward, the light from the overhead lamps glinting off her severe glasses. Here are the terms of the surrender. Mrs. Reynolds will receive the McLean property free and clear. She will receive 70% of all liquid marital assets, the real total, not the fraction you lied about. She will receive full physical and legal custody of your daughter, Lily. No, Rick whispered. I won't give up Lily. She's my daughter. She is your testament to prosperity, Ava said. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of her voice made Rick flinch. It was steady, devoid of the trembling fear he had cultivated in her. To you, Lily was a trophy, a way to show the world you had the perfect life. You didn't even know the name of her ballet teacher, Rick. You forgot her birthday last year because you were at a board meeting that turned out to be a weekend in Cabo. Ava, I was working for us. You were working for you, she countered. I was the one who built the world she lives in. You were just the man who paid the bills with stolen money. Isabel Rossi silenced the room with a sharp tap of her pen. There's more. A permanent gag order regarding Mrs. Reynolds and Mr. Finch. And finally, the matter of the U.S. Attorney's Office. She slid a second, much thinner folder across the table. This, Isabel said, is a courtesy copy of the criminal referral we have prepared. It details the wire fraud, the tax evasion, and the systematic embezzlement. Our courier is currently standing downstairs in the lobby. He has instructions to deliver this to the federal prosecutor at exactly 12 p.m. today. Rick looked at the clock on the wall. 11:42 a.m. If you sign the settlement agreement now, Isabel continued, Mrs. Reynolds has agreed to a clause of non-disclosure. We will not file the referral. You will walk away a poor man, Mr. Sterling, but you will walk away a free one. You have 18 minutes to decide if you want to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The escalation had reached its peak. Rick looked at the papers. He looked at the obsidian table. He looked at the palette knife in Ava's hand. For 15 years, he had been the one holding the knife. He had been the one who scraped her life clean of color, who told her she was a hobby, who convinced her that without him, she was nothing. He had built a fortress of lies and called it an empire. And now, the foundation had turned to sand. Ava, Rick choked out, his eyes welling with a desperate, selfish grief. You can't do this. 14 million. I'll have nothing. I'll be living in a studio apartment. I'll be a nobody. Ava looked at him, and for the first time, a small, sad smile touched her lips. She leaned over the table, her face inches from his. Being a nobody is exactly what you offered me, Rick, she whispered. You offered me a pittance and told me to be smart. You told me I had no claim to your life. I'm just returning the favor. I'm setting you free, just like you said you were doing for me. She stood up, the cream-colored dress catching the light. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the artist she had always been, finally stepping back to view a finished masterpiece. Sign the papers, Rick, she said. The courier doesn't like to be kept waiting. Rick Sterling looked at the clock. 11:51 a.m. With a hand that shook so violently he had to grip his wrist with the other, he picked up the heavy gold-plated pen. He began to sign. 1 page, 2 pages, 10. He was signing away the house, the cars, the status, the lifeboat, and the mirror he had used to worship himself. As he reached the final signature, he looked up at Isabel Rossi. Who is he, this mutual acquaintance? Why would Alistair Finch care about a woman like Ava? Isabel Rossi didn't answer. Instead, the double doors of the kill room opened. The silver-haired man from the video call, Alistair Finch himself, walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing the same simple cashmere coat he had worn 8 years ago in the rain. He walked over to Ava and placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't even acknowledge Rick's existence. He looked at the papers on the table, then at Ava. "The debt is settled, Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked. "Yes," Ava said, her voice full of a quiet, radiant power. "The balance is restored." Alistair turned his gaze to Rick then, and for a second Rick saw the true face of a billionaire. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was as cold and vast as the deep ocean. "You underestimated the value of kindness, Mr. Sterling," Alistair said. "In my world, that is the most expensive mistake a man can make." Rick dropped the pen. It rolled across the obsidian table and fell to the floor with a tiny, pathetic click. The show-up was not a loud, public execution, but something far more devastating to a man like Rick Sterling, a quiet, total erasure. By the time the afternoon sun attempted to pierce the grey Washington clouds, the legal machinery of Blackwood and Finch had moved with the speed of a digital virus. The settlement was filed, the deeds were transferred, and the non-disclosure agreements were locked in a vault. Rick was escorted from the building not by Isabel Rossi, but by a junior security guard who didn't even know his name. Rick stood on the sidewalk of the wharf, his single suitcase at his feet. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and smelling of river salt and exhaust. He checked his phone. His corporate email account was gone. His LinkedIn profile was a graveyard of page not found. His contacts, the men he'd golfed with, the women he'd impressed at galas, had vanished as if they had never existed. He was a man without a digital shadow. He walked to a nearby ATM, inserted his remaining personal debit card, and hit account balance. $204.18. The number stared back at him, mocking and minuscule. This was his new beginning. Not a yacht in Monaco or a penthouse in Miami, but a cheap rental in a part of Arlington he used to drive through with his windows rolled up. While Rick was discovering the weight of his own irrelevance, Ava was standing in the center of the McLean house. It was hers now, truly hers. The exclude order had been lifted, and the silence of the house no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a fresh coat of gesso on a rough canvas. She walked through the rooms, her hand trailing along the walls. She stopped in the sunroom, the place where she had once tucked away her dreams to make room for Rick's empire. On the center of the floor stood a large wooden crate. It hadn't been there that morning. Ava knelt and used the edge of her palette knife to pry up the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of acid-free paper, were her old paintings. The ones Rick had told her to put on hold. The ones he had claimed were just a hobby. They weren't damaged. They were pristine. At the very top was a note on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. A mutual acquaintance kept these in a climate-controlled facility for the last 8 years. He believed the world wasn't quite ready for them yet. He thinks the world is ready now. Isabel. Ava pulled out the first canvas. It was a landscape of the Potomac at dawn, the same river she had just looked out at from the 50th floor. The colors were vibrant, the light so skillfully captured that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Tears blurred her vision, hot and thick. She hadn't just reclaimed her house, she had reclaimed the girl who believed she could capture the sun with a brush. The resolution of Ava's life began that night. She didn't call a moving company to bring back the heavy, ornate furniture Rick had loved. Instead, she called a local charity and told them to take everything. The leather sofas, the mahogany dining table, the rugs that cost more than a teacher's salary, all of it. By the end of the week, the house was nearly empty, echoing with the sound of Lily's laughter as they played tag in the cavernous living room. "Mom, look!" Lily shouted, pointing to the sunroom. Ava had moved all her easels in there. The room was no longer a sunroom, it was a studio. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil had finally defeated the ghost of Rick's expensive cologne. "What are you going to paint first?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with a newfound pride in her mother. Ava picked up her palette knife. She looked at the blank white canvas standing on the easel. The white wasn't empty. It was full of every possibility she had once thought was dead. "I'm going to paint the truth, Lily," Ava said, "and for the first time, I don't need anyone's permission to finish it." The epilogue of the Sterling divorce became a whispered legend in the Northern Virginia social circles. People talked about the Billionaire's legal team as if it were a ghost story, a warning to the arrogant men who thought they could break the women who built them. 1 year later, the Georgetown air was crisp with the promise of autumn. A warm, inviting light spilled from the large plate-glass window of a newly opened gallery on M Street. The name was scripted in elegant gold leaf, Phoenix Fine Arts. Ava stood just inside the door, greeting a wave of guests. She was wearing a simple, flowing black silk dress. She looked radiant, not because of the jewelry she wore none, but because of the peace that radiated from her. The gallery was a map of her journey. Near the entrance hung a tumultuous, jagged piece in bruised purples and blacks, the scraping. But as you moved further into the room, the colors began to glow. At the far end, dominating the space, was her masterpiece, Dawn. It was a breathtaking explosion of gold, pink, and brilliant white. It was the painting of a woman who had been through the fire and found that she was made of something that couldn't burn. Lily, now 11 and possessing a quiet poise that mirrored her mother's, was handing out catalogues. She was no longer the child who tiptoed around a tense father. She was a confident young lady who looked at her mother not as the domestic scenery, but as a hero. "Ava, your work is transcendent," gushed Maria, a local art critic whose review had already set the DC art world on fire. "The emotional honesty. It's staggering. Where does it come from?" "It comes from a debt," Ava said, her voice steady and clear. "A debt of kindness that I finally learned to pay to myself." She caught sight of a quiet figure near the back of the gallery, standing before Dawn. It was Alistair Finch. He looked perfectly inconspicuous in a simple tweed jacket, holding a glass of sparkling water. Ava gracefully excused herself and made her way over to him. "I was hoping you'd make it," she said softly. "I wouldn't miss the triumphant return of my favorite artist," Alistair replied, his gaze fixed on the painting. "This one, it's what every person hopes for after a period of darkness, the arrival of the light. I'd like to purchase it." "Alistair, you've done enough. I can't." "I will be paying full market price, Ava," he said, his expression kind but unyielding. "The piece will hang in the main lobby of Finch Consolidated in New York. I am not a philanthropist. I am an investor. And I consider an investment in unapologetic brilliance to be the soundest one a person can make." Ava understood then. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering respect. He was treating her as a professional and an equal. It was the final brick in the foundation of her new life. "In that case," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face, "my gallery manager will be thrilled to take your call tomorrow." Miles away, across the Potomac River, the grey of Arlington was setting in. Rick Sterling pulled his dented Honda Accord into the cracked asphalt lot of his apartment complex. His job selling industrial cleaning supplies, the only job he could get with his liquidated reputation, was a daily exercise in humiliation managed by a man 20 years his junior. He trudged toward his unit, his cheap khaki pants damp from a puddle he hadn't seen. As he reached his door, he stopped. On the ground was a discarded newspaper. On the front of the local art section was a picture of Ava. She was standing in her gallery, surrounded by light, laughing with Alistair Finch. She looked like a queen who had finally come home. Rick stood frozen, a ghost on the edge of her brilliant world. The regret that hit him wasn't about the $14 million. It wasn't about the Porsche or the club membership. It was the laughter. He realized with a horrifying clarity that carved out his insides that Ava had blossomed in his absence. His presence had been the blight, the shadow that kept her from the sun. He hadn't just lost a divorce. He had lost the privilege of being part of her light. He turned away from the image and entered his silent, stale-smelling apartment. He had chosen the shadows, and now he had to live in them. Ava's story is a testament to the fact that the universe has a way of balancing the scales, often through the most unexpected acts of kindness. It reminds us that our true value isn't found in what we acquire, but in the integrity of who we are when no one is watching. If you were moved by Ava's journey from betrayal to brilliance, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to know that the light always returns. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that prove truth is more powerful than fiction. Thanks for watching.